If somebody were to ask you to name the most accurate geopolitical forecaster alive today, you would probably reach for a famous newspaper or a think tank in Washington, or one of the men who stand in front of a wall of monitors on cable television and explain what is about to happen in the world. And you would almost certainly be wrong. The man with the receipts is a high school teacher in Beijing. His name is Jiang Xueqin. He has a bachelor's degree in English from Yale and nothing after it. He teaches the great books in a class on game theory to teenagers, and he started uploading his lectures to YouTube in the summer of 2023. That channel has 2.68 million subscribers. That is roughly the population of the city of Chicago. Every man, woman, and child all subscribe to a man who has never run a single advertisement and has never taken a single sponsor. There are 177 videos on the channel. Together they have been watched almost 95 million times. In one of his earliest lectures, he made 3 claims on the record. He said Donald Trump would win the 2024 election. He said the United States would go to war with Iran. And he said the United States would lose that war. The first is history. The second became real on the 28th of February of this year. And the third is the strange one, because in the 21st century, a superpower does not always lose a war the way you would expect it to. Sometimes the defeat is dressed up as a signing ceremony. Across roughly 40 lectures since 2023, he has made about 140 separate predictions covering Iran, Russia, China, Israel, Europe, the dollar, artificial intelligence, and the end of the world. We pulled every forward-looking claim he has made onto a single ledger so that for once you could check the whole forecast against what has actually happened. We are going to go through all 9 arcs of it, one at a time. We will start where he started, with Iran. When the United States loses the war, it started. This is the spine of the forecast. Almost a third of his predictions hang off it. The claim is simple, and at the time he made it, it sounded insane. America bombs Iran. America cannot win from the air. America commits ground troops, signs a national draft to feed them, and still loses. And the losing is what ends the American empire in the Middle East. The war began on the 28th of February. The United States and Israel opened with nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours, and the first wave killed Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Within 6 days, the US military had flown more than 2,000 sorties and sunk almost the entire Iranian surface navy. Iran could not answer in the air because it had no air force left worth the name, so it reached for the one thing it controls instead. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Look at the map for a moment, because the geography is the whole story. The Strait of Hormuz is a channel just 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, with Iran on the entire northern shore. On an ordinary day, 1/5 of all the oil consumed on planet Earth passes through that gap. Iran mined it, fired on the ships that tried to cross it, and within a week, roughly 3,000 merchant vessels were trapped. About 1/10 of the world's entire container fleet sitting at anchor, going nowhere. The price of oil began to climb, and it has not come back down. 2 of his early calls settled almost at once. He said China would stay out of the fighting, supplying weapons but never soldiers. It did. He said no nuclear weapon would be used. None was. And then the war did the one thing his specific script did not call for. It slowed down, and it turned into paperwork. On the 17th of June, standing at the G7 summit in the French spa town of Evian, Donald Trump and the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a document called the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding.
14 points.
A 60-day window to negotiate a permanent end to the war. The cable channels called it a peace deal. Jiang called it something more precise. He called it the sound of an empire climbing down a ladder. So watch the ladder, rung by rung, because the descent is the argument. First, Washington said the goal was to free Iran, to make Iran great again. That was dropped. Then the goal was regime change, an operation the Pentagon literally named Epic Fury. The regime did not change. Then the demand was unconditional surrender. And then the President of the United States signed a memorandum in which he called the Iranians very rational and nice to deal with and agreed that Iran could keep its missiles, his stated reason being that Saudi Arabia has missiles too. A country does not climb down from "we will free you" to "you may keep your weapons" because it is winning. Now read the 14 points the way you would read any contract, ask who pays and who collects. The United States agreed to lift its naval blockade within 30 days. It agreed, on day 1, to waive sanctions on Iranian oil, freeing roughly 67 million barrels that had been trapped on tankers, and the buyer of that oil is China. It agreed to dismantle, on a schedule, every sanction a decade of American policy had built. And together with its Gulf partners, it agreed to a reconstruction fund for Iran of at least $300 billion. $300 billion is larger than the entire yearly economic output of a country like Finland, handed to the government Washington had been bombing 100 days earlier. In return, Iran agreed to use its best efforts to let ships through Hormuz, repeated a sentence it has spoken for 20 years that it will not build a nuclear weapon, and agreed to dilute some enriched uranium at home. That is the trade, and the people closest to it described it the way Jiang did, not the way the podium did. An analyst at the Atlantic Council wrote the cleanest version of it. Israel lost this war, and Iran conceded nothing tangible beyond letting the ships pass. Inside Israel, only 18% of the public supports the deal. Inside Trump's own party, senators broke with him: Ted Cruz, Roger Wicker, Bill Cassidy, and on the 24th of June, the Senate voted to limit the president's power to keep fighting, with 4 Republicans crossing the aisle. But Yang's sharpest point is the one almost everyone gets backwards, and it is about the money. He says the $300 billion is not the prize, and arguing about who writes the check misses the point. The prize is the lifting of the sanctions. And here is the detail that makes it matter. China obeys American sanctions. It obeys them to keep the global economy stable. So for a decade, the real cage around Iran was never the bombs. It was a sanctions regime so heavy that even Beijing respected it. The moment Washington agrees to take that cage apart, Iran sells its oil to China at full volume, takes Chinese technology, and rebuilds. In Jiang's view, that is the actual defeat, not a dollar figure. But the discovery that the most powerful economic weapon America owns no longer works on a country willing to absorb the pain. And then there is the question of what all of this actually bought, because none of it existed before the 28th of February. There was no closed strait, no trapped fleet, no $300 billion bill, no oil shock before a war that was supposed to be finished in a few weeks. Strip the diplomacy away, and the memorandum is mostly an agreement to pay to undo the damage the war itself created. Whoever ends up funding that is not buying peace. They are paying for a wound the buyer inflicted on himself. We will be just as honest about the part of his forecast this threatens, because he is honest about it himself. His specific mechanism was a ground invasion and a national draft. Neither has happened. Asked about it directly, he did not pretend otherwise. He said the timeline is longer than people think. The ground invasion comes after the midterm elections, perhaps next February or March, partly because you cannot march an army across the Iranian desert in summer. So the destination he named, American retreat, is arriving. The road he drew to it may turn out wrong. He says it plainly, he is good at the direction and unreliable on the date. And the clearest sign that this is a pause and not an ending is that the memorandum did not survive 2 weeks. On the 25th of June, an Iranian drone hit a Singapore-flagged cargo ship, the Ever Lovely, as it left Hormuz along the Omani coast inside the strait Iran had just promised to keep open. The United Nations suspended an evacuation of roughly 600 ships and 11,000 stranded sailors. On the 26th, the United States struck back inside Iran, and then it did not stop. On the 27th, a second tanker, the Kiku, was hit by a drone in the same strait. The United States launched a second night of strikes on Iranian missile sites, drone stores, and coastal radar. And this time, Iran hit back directly. Its Revolutionary Guard fired on American positions across the Gulf and sent a wave of drones at Bahrain. Bahrain is a small island about 200 kilometers across the Gulf from the Iranian coast, and it happens to be the home of the United States Navy's 5th Fleet. Bahrain condemned the strike as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty and accused Tehran of sabotaging the peace. By the morning of the 28th, American forces had bombed Iran for a 3rd straight night. The man who said this war could not actually be ended is so far watching it refuse to be ended. 2. America comes apart at home, and Trump runs past the Constitution. The 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution limits a president to 2 elected terms. Jiang's claim is that this rule does not survive the decade. The mechanism: J.D. Vance wins in 2028 with Trump as his running mate, then steps aside and hands the office back to Trump. If that fails, emergency war powers suspend the election outright. Either way, the same man finishes the decade in the White House. And the country he runs is coming apart. A draft radicalizes a generation of young men with no intention of dying in the Iranian desert. Political violence becomes ordinary. The federal government is captured quietly by the technology companies that are by then the only growth engine left. And the empire that can no longer hold the Middle East turns inward and starts collecting its own hemisphere instead. That part you can already watch. Trump has floated annexing Greenland. He has talked about Canada. He has proposed making Venezuela a state. In his interview, Jiang sharpened it: when the Middle East becomes a quagmire. He expects Washington to go hunting for an easier, more winnable target closer to home: Cuba, Greenland, Colombia, Canada. Something to feed the military and the voters before the hard years arrive. An empire that cannot win abroad goes looking for somewhere it can. Israel replaces America as the empire, and Lebanon is the live test. This is the keystone of the whole forecast. He has stated some version of it in at least 14 lectures. The territorial claim is enormous. It runs from the Nile to the Euphrates, the land the Hebrew Bible describes as promised to the descendants of Abraham, taking in parts of Egypt, all of Lebanon, all of Syria, all of Jordan, and parts of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. That is roughly 400,000 square miles, about 47 times the size of the state of Israel as it exists today. His sequence is specific: Iran first, happening now, Turkey next, the Gulf monarchies hollowed out by what the war does to energy markets, the 35,000 American troops in the region absorbed by Israel on the day the Americans go home. And inside the project he predicts the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the building of the Third Temple on its foundation, and the return of the Jewish diaspora to Israel. You do not have to take the 50-year version on faith, because this arc has a live test running right now, and its name is Lebanon. In his interview, Jiang called Lebanon the single most important issue in the deal, and the reason the deal cannot hold. The logic is airtight. For 40 years, Iran's real defense has not been its own army, it has been its proxies, the axis of resistance, and the strongest surviving piece of that network is Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Iran is trapped. If it abandons Hezbollah, it gives up the one shield that keeps it from being encircled by the ring of American bases around it. So it cannot. But Israel will not leave southern Lebanon either, because Lebanon is the next square on the board. 2 players, 1 square, neither able to move. That is why Jiang says there is no resolution available here. And in the last 48 hours, that abstract deadlock turned into a signed document that broke the same day it was signed. On the 27th of June, the United States brokered a framework agreement between Israel and Lebanon, announced by Secretary of State Marco Rubio as a first step toward ending the cycle of war. Within hours, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said plainly that Israel would not leave southern Lebanon until Hezbollah disarms. His defense minister ordered Israeli troops to prepare for an extended stay in the so-called security zone, the strip of Lebanese land south of the Litani River, about 30 kilometers deep. Hezbollah rejected the agreement outright, calling it a surrender of sovereignty, and its supporters poured into the streets of southern Beirut to say so. And on the same day the framework was signed, an Israeli airstrike on the southern town of Nabatia al-Falqa killed at least 1 person and wounded 2 more. The Lebanese president Joseph Aoun was reduced to phoning Trump to beg Washington to press Israel to withdraw. A peace agreement that produced a dead body in the south on the day it was signed is not a peace agreement, it is the deadlock Jiang described with a signature on it. And notice the other thing this arc predicted that is now plainly true: the protector and the client are pulling apart. Trump signed the Iran deal without showing Netanyahu the text, overruled him on Lebanon, and reminded the world that, in his telling, Israel would not exist without American money. Jiang reads the rift as real but shallow, a recalibration with America stepping into the shadows and pushing Israel to the front, so that Israel absorbs the blame for whatever the next phase costs. 4. Russia returns as a continental power and breaks NATO. The 4th arc is the mirror of the 2nd. America retreats from Eurasia, and Russia fills the space behind it. Russia encircles Odessa on the Black Sea coast, the European front forms there, and NATO soldiers begin dying in Ukrainian uniforms. The casualties trigger unrest in France, Britain, and Poland. By 2029, Germany sends ground combat troops to Ukraine, which would be the first German ground combat outside its borders since 1945, and over time Berlin drifts away from Washington and back toward the energy and industry partnership with Moscow that defined the continent before 1940. From there it widens. Russia and India deepen into a long partnership. Russia's shadow tanker fleet, around 1,000 ships already sailing outside Western insurance, is armed, producing the first major war on the open ocean since 1945. Turkey is pulled in, its government implodes, and Russia ends up with effective control of the Bosphorus, the strait at Istanbul men have fought over for 600 years. Putin frames all of it as restoring Constantinople and casts Moscow as the third Rome. And in the long run, he predicts Russia and China fall out, because Russia wants a Eurasia of several great powers, and China wants one with China on top. Europe breaks down inside while it loses the war outside. Europe fails along 2 axes at once. The first is military. European armies fight Russia at Odessa, lose, and NATO ends as a credible alliance. The second is internal, migration. The energy shortage that follows the closure of 2 maritime choke points, and the shock of a lost foreign war combine into civil conflict inside the larger European states, France, Britain, and Poland on his list. The picture he paints over the next 5 to 20 years is declining freedom, economic collapse, mass migration, and civil war at home. This is the longest fused part of the forecast, and the 2029 German deployment is the only hard date in it. The early reading worth logging is that NATO is no longer being treated as a bystander. After the alliance's Secretary General spoke about the war, Iran's foreign ministry accused NATO of active complicity, and the question of which European capitals were inside the decision and which were outside it is now a live fight rather than a hypothetical. 6. The Pacific reorganizes, and Japan is rearming on schedule. The sixth arc is what Asia does while America's attention is nailed to Iran. China stays out of the war militarily, which has held. Trump goes to Beijing and cuts a grand bargain. The United States stops backing Taiwanese independence and endorses unification. China buys American energy at scale. And the two economies knot tighter instead of decoupling. Outside that bargain, North Korea uses the distraction to squeeze South Korea, a country whose birth rate is now the lowest any nation has ever recorded in peacetime, and South Korea begins its slide toward collapse as a coherent state. And his earliest Pacific call is already in this week's headlines. Japan is rearming. Tokyo is driving its defense budget toward 2% of its economy, has set new spending records 12 years running, scrapped its post-war ban on exporting lethal weapons, and is openly moving to revise Article 9, the clause in its constitution that has renounced war for 80 years. At the Shangri-La Defense Summit in Singapore, China's defense ministry called it the gray rhino of a remilitarized Japan gathering speed. He used the same word for it years ago. The word was rearmament. 7. The financial system is engineered into a crisis and rebuilt somewhere else. The seventh arc is monetary, and it connects straight back to the first. His claim is that the coming financial collapse is not an accident but an engineered one, in roughly the shape of 2008, by people who already know the crash is coming and have positioned themselves for what gets built afterward. The trigger is an energy shock. Fuel prices climb high enough to collapse mass market aviation and shrink the tourism economy that employs much of Europe. A pension crisis follows as a huge cohort of retirees meets a much smaller cohort of workers. The technology companies, by then the only growth left, are bailed out, and the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency erodes in the same window. This is where the Iran arc feeds the money arc. A resurgent, unsanctioned Iran, bound tighter to Russia and China, forms a Eurasian trade bloc that pulls the center of economic gravity toward Asia. And for Japan, Europe, and Africa, trading with that bloc starts to look safer than holding dollars. In his telling, the replacement instrument is issued from Israel. The resource-poor countries collapse first, and famine spreads as the chains of imported food and fuel break. The world government is an artificial intelligence, and it is built in Jerusalem. The eighth arc is what comes after the reset. Every transaction runs through a central bank digital currency. Every citizen carries a digital identity. The next step is a subdermal chip, the kind already used to track livestock, sold to people as a wallet, a passport, a key. Artificial companions outcompete human relationships at the scale of whole populations, and the share of people who never marry climbs toward a majority. At the center of the system, he predicts, is an artificial intelligence built in Jerusalem, which over time becomes the world government, seated in his telling on the foundation where the third temple is raised. He flags this himself as the point where his geopolitics shades into prophecy. 9. The end time. The ninth arc is the one he labels eschatological. Over the next 50 years, he predicts that war, famine, and ecological collapse together kill roughly 90% of humanity. A magnetic pole excursion, which the geological record shows runs on a cycle of about 10,000 years and is overdue, brings a mini ice age. The world turns on Israel in the war Christian scripture calls Gog and Magog, and the sequence ends in the second coming. He does not offer this one as a forecast in the same sense as the others. He offers it as the frame the others sit inside, the scorecard. Out of his roughly 140 predictions, here is what can be checked today. The bombing of Iran happened. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz happened. China staying out militarily happened. No nuclear weapon used held. Germany rearming, Japan rearming, both happening now. Anti-Semitism rising worldwide happening. Trump moving on Venezuela and Greenland happening. And the largest claim of the first arc, that the United States cannot win this war and will choose to leave it, is now written into a 14-point memorandum in which the superpower lifts the sanctions, reopens the oil to China, promises $300 billion, and pulls its forces back, while the country it was bombing keeps its missiles, its proxies, and its enriched uranium. By the test he set 2 years ago, that is the shape of a retreat. We will be equally clear about what is under pressure. He said the road to that retreat would run through a ground invasion and a national draft. So far it has run through a memorandum instead. If the memorandum somehow holds, the invasion and the draft never come, and that branch is simply wrong, even though the destination still arrives. He says it himself, right on the direction, unreliable on the date. But the part of the deal that most supports his deeper thesis is the part the deal could not close. The war was sold as the way to end Iran's nuclear program. The memorandum does not end it. Iran kept its stockpile of roughly 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, refused to give up the right to enrich, and within days disputed whether it had even agreed to let the inspectors back in. You cannot bomb a country out of the knowledge of how to enrich, and you cannot make it trade away the one card that keeps it from being invaded again. That is the structure underneath his forecast, and it is the thing the deal left standing. So here is the honest tally. The broad direction of his first arc is holding, and holding hard. One of its specific mechanisms is in doubt. The Lebanon deadlock he named as the reason the deal cannot last is pulling it apart in real time, a framework signed and broken inside a single day. And the remaining 130-odd predictions are still open, the civilizational ones resolving over decades, the eschatological ones on no timeline a person gets to check. A high school teacher in Beijing, with an English degree, no institutional affiliation, and no advertisers, called the war, called who would stay out of it, called the weapons that would not be used, and called the way it would end before any of it happened. He also called a draft that has not come, and a ground invasion that for now has not either. 131 of his predictions are still pending. We will check back.